Pattern recognition is also an important skill for designing sustainable systems. The ability to understand, identify, and recognize the way that nature patterns itself, the way mass and energy move and manifest and concentrate or dissipate through our environment can really help you design with those flows of energy and mass and not against them, making your system more sustainable. And some of it boils down to just understanding certain repetitive patterns that are seen in nature and using those designs and patterns in your landscape or permaculture design. The human environment tends to oppose a lot of the natural flows that we see out there in the world. Well, at least the Western culture does. Our homes are cubes and they're very rectilinear, 90-degree angles, straight lines. And in nature, you rarely see straight lines, cubes, and 90-degree angles. You do see them once in a while, but rarely, and really rarely in the natural world that's living in biota or biological organisms. You sometimes see the straight lines and right angles and things like that in like crystalline structures of minerals and rocks, but again, not very much in living things. So recognizing how we can make our human designs and built environment more in sync with the rest of nature will help make them more sustainable and less need to maintain them. Some of the different types of energy flows on a site include solar energy that comes from the sun, gets trapped by plants or by the soil, water flows that comes to the site from the sky or from creeks or from groundwater or for irrigation systems where it originates from and where it flows to on the site. Soil and nutrients that can be carried by water or come from other sources of erosion, wind energy, wildlife movements and migrations through the property, and human movement too on the site. For each of these types of energy flows, we can ask ourselves a number of questions to help understand how they are affecting the site. For example, with water and energy, the permaculture designer can think, how does the water move across that piece of land? And as the designer is on the piece of land, think about and observe, where does the water come from? Where does the water flow to? Where are the high spots where the water flows away from, and where are the low spots where it pools up? Is the water eroding the land? Is it moving fast enough to carry sediments? Is it depositing those sediments somewhere else? And where's the water being stored on the site? So when you visit your site and do some observations like you will this week, if you're lucky enough during a rainstorm, you can see where the water hits, how it hits on the land, and where it moves to, and how that might affect where you would place elements in your design. Solar energy is another energy flow that's important to analyze at a site too, and can help in design. How does the sun move across that piece of land throughout the day and throughout the seasons? The sun is higher in the sky in the summer and lower in the winter. How does the angle of that sun's incidence change and affect the land and plants and animals? What parts of the site are hottest in the morning? Which are hottest in the afternoon? And which are the cool spots? Kind of a fun activity that I heard from a permaculture designer that I used to know. He lived in town here for a long time. Was he said he would get hired by clients and bring a chair and just go sit there for hours and just watch how the sun moved and the shadows moved and the wind. And he said if there was a cat on site, watch it as the day progresses. It'll walk around and find the sunny spots and move itself to lay in the sun throughout the day. He said his clients were a little suspect when all he did is sit there and stare into the landscape for hours. But it makes sense because we're so used to taking action before we have all the information. But to stop and observe and just listen to the land, pay attention, and observe all these energy flows really is the starting point for sustainable design. Soil and nutrient flows. Is the soil eroding from one spot and being deposited in another? Are the soils thin and impermeable, causing runoff? Or are they well drained and the rain infiltrates quickly when the sprinklers are on? Where's the soil darker and lighter? How is it changing with the topography? Or is erosion a big problem? Rocks, clay, too much sand? So if you're able to go to the site during a rain event, that would be great to see the movement of water across the land and see if it's fast enough or steep enough to pick up sediments and move them around and change the soil and nutrient deposition and concentrations. Wind energy. You have a chance to watch the way the wind moves through the site, which direction do the winds come from. Depends which season you're observing. Realize that winds often change their direction and intensity with seasons. Here in the south coast of California, we tend to get winds from the northwest during the winter and from the northeast or southwest in the summer. So they really do shift quite a bit, and that can affect lots of things, including fire patterns. So take time to notice which way the wind comes from and how strong the wind is. Consider that it could be utilized, meaning if you have a strong wind that's consistently from one direction in a certain season, then you can design around that. Perhaps you'll want to utilize that wind if certain areas, animal pens, the human dwelling, or even garden areas get too hot. You would want to put them in the line of that wind so those winds can cool those areas down. But the opposite can be true too, is that you might want to block that wind from certain areas that you want to heat up. It could be an animal pen in the winter. It could be the human dwelling. It could be vegetable gardens that need to stay warmer, that if they're exposed to the wind will not be so good. So you could build a windbreak or locate those elements in different places that aren't as exposed to the wind as other locations. Wildlife patterns are an interesting flow to also observe on the site. Birds and insects, like butterflies, are probably one of the easiest things to see. Most times when you go to a site, you can see some birds and perhaps some insects flying in and out and see where they tend to come from and where they tend to congregate on site and how they leave the site, so the flows. You can also see signs of other animals like coyotes, rabbits, lizards, snakes, skunks, other mammals and reptiles. Possibly you'll see tracks or marks of where they've settled down for a rest or eaten something. Not always will you see those, but those are things to pay attention to. Sometimes you want to draw more wildlife in and design your system so that it helps the wildlife. Sometimes you might want to deter some of the wildlife too, especially things like skunks or coyotes if you have some farm animals that you want to protect. But ants too are an interesting animal to observe and look at their action and flows on the site. All of these things are things that you can be utilized in your design to the benefit of the whole system. And human flow on the site. If you're dealing with a public site, you might get a lot of good observations of humans coming in and out of the site and the paths they generally tend to take at the site. How often do they come? How many? What's the purpose? Are they coming as a moving through the area? It's just kind of a thoroughfare, or are they coming and stopping and staying in the area? If you were dealing with like a residential landscape or something like that, then it'd be a little different. You'd be asking the clients, how do you want to use the site? Do you tend to want to go over here and sit, and you want a little lawn to play sports on? But you would ask about the energy flows that are intended. But if it's a bigger site or a public site, then you'll look at the actions that you know will be happening there, or watch those activities of humans on the site as they're happening. So are there spots where humans like to stay a while on site? Other places of human migration or just movement through the area? Do humans visit the site every day? What are the times of day? So again, these things are the way you can design paths, rest areas, and do them more efficiently for where humans tend to want to go already. Sometimes people, like public parks, will put in benches, rest areas in places where humans don't want to hang out, like out in the sun, instead of under the shade of a tree. So these are ways that you can work with the flows. Back to the idea of natural patterns. Energy and mass manifest in a number of repeating patterns and shapes in the cosmos and our world. So we learn to recognize those. And the rest of the slides on this presentation are pictures of natural patterns that repeat. And I'll talk a little bit about each of those. Circles are a natural pattern. You see circles in many aspects of living organisms and even non-living organisms, but it's a pattern of energy and mass formation into this circular shape or circular growth or expansion or cycles that tends to be almost ubiquitous throughout our world and our cosmos. You even see it in the movement of the planets and stellar movements too. So circles and circular-like actions are a very prominent natural pattern. Another circle pattern, the concentric circles and spherical patterns of a dandelion seed head. Many, many flowers have circular patterns. This is the passion vine, where it was named after the suffering and death of Jesus Christ, the Passion, and the 5 petals and 5 sepals represent the 10 apostles who remained faithful to Jesus, and the 3 parts of the stigma, the female part, represent the Holy Trinity. That's why it's called that. But lots of cool circles here too, and just a beautiful flower. And again, I think that a lot of the reasons we find beauty in these natural repeating patterns is we are also made of these similar patterns, and so we see them and we like them because they feel like they are familiar. This is a spiral circular pattern of velvet agave leaves as they mature and open up. The concentric circles that are formed from water droplets hitting a surface of water. And the circular growth pattern of branches off of a central tree's trunk, like this Bunya Bunya tree in Alameda Park, downtown Santa Barbara. It's also a tree that's closely related to the monkey puzzle tree. Sometimes this is mistakenly called that. But this is another pattern too, is the starburst, where there's a central point and a bunch of growth radiating out from a central point. And actually, we've seen that in all these flowers pictures so far. That's another really common natural pattern. The circular growth of petals off of the central point of a flower. This is a camellia. It's a double camellia where there's twice as many petals that are all symmetrically arranged, nested on top of each other, making it really neat. Camellia is the genus or the group of plants that all our teas come from. Black, green, white tea. They're all from camellias. This camellia is not that same camellia variety. This was bred to have these really beautiful double flowers. These very popular succulents, echeverias, have a nice circular and actually spiral pattern to their leaves as well. The circular patterns of certain cacti, including these barrel cactus, not a good place to take a rest. And these circular patterns, spherical patterns of these sweet gum fruits, the seed heads on the sweet gum. And of course, if you start looking at the human body, you'll find many, many places where the circular patterning is seen in the iris, in the cornea of the eye, in the shape of our vascular system. Each vein or artery is like a tube. Our bone structure, inside cells, even organelles within cells, that circular shape. There's a reason why circles form. They're energetically very efficient, and that's why they've evolved to be a major building block of all living things. Coming along with circles often are spirals, another very common shape in the natural world. The nautilus here, this nautilus mollusk organism whose shell is beautifully spirally shaped like many other mollusks, and it follows the spiral pattern, the golden mean, and we see this over and over again in nature. And humans, you might find a spiral pattern in our fingerprints as one example. And here's the nautilus shell cut in half so you can see the many chambers within it and the beautiful near perfect spiral pattern. And this is a fiddlehead fern frond. Most ferns, fronds, or leaves unroll from this spiral shape to begin with. And if you've ever looked at the top of a violin or viola or cello or fiddle, they all have that spiral shape, And a fiddle, the instrument, is called a fiddle because of that spiral shape that looks like the fern. I actually don't know if it was which came first, the instrument top or the fern name, but they're both called fiddleheads for the spiral shape. If you are someone who likes to collect plants, this is young fern fronds before they've opened up, or this spiral pattern, are very commonly eaten by many cultures throughout the world. They're harvested and cooked. There are a few, including the bracken fern, which that should not be done because they have carcinogens in them. They can make you pretty sick over time. Soaking in water and cooking and being heated with some kind of alkaline base like lime is supposed to detoxify those ferns that do have the carcinogens in them, but please don't try this without further research. This looks very similar to the fern frond spiral pattern, but this is an insectivorous plant called the sundew, one of its leaves unfurling or unrolling to become mature. And these little droplets are sticky, insects get stuck to that, and the plant is able to slowly digest them by exuding enzymes which break down the insect while it's stuck to the plant, and then the nutrients that were in the insect's body can be absorbed. Water can also form spirals. We see that in currents in the oceans, eddies in rivers and creeks on the side. Simplest spiral in water is in your sink or toilet as you flush. The water goes down in a spiral pattern. And due to the Coriolis effect, named after Gaspar de Coriolis, who first kind of formalized and talked about this dynamic, which relates to the rotation of the Earth, is these water patterns, these eddies or spiral patterns in water, move counterclockwise in the northern hemisphere and clockwise in the southern hemisphere due to the rotation of the Earth. So check that out next time you flush the toilet. Also, leaves on plants that grow in a spiral pattern off of the stem will grow counterclockwise in the northern hemisphere and clockwise in the southern hemisphere due to the same effect. Other spirals that I don't have images for are hurricanes or spirals, the way they form and move. So our solar system moves in a spiral pattern slowly, as does our galaxy, as does our universe. It's been shown to be moving slowly in a spiral pattern. So there's many examples out there. This is a chameleon's tail in this beautiful spiral pattern. Another plant, succulent, that is showing this very obvious and beautifully symmetrical spiral pattern in its leaf positioning. It's an aloe. Here is a spiral pattern, but you see spirals upon spirals upon spirals, which is making it a fractal pattern. This is Romanesco broccoli. Another beautiful example of spirals in nature are the spiral patterning of the flowers and then the seeds on the head of a sunflower. Branching is also a very common shape and pattern that you see in nature, like in lightning, this really quick ephemeral branching pattern that you see from the weakly charged particles moving through the air, kind of moving through the path of least resistance, branch off and split off over and over again to form this overall pattern. And the branching veins on the petals of this beautiful orchid. This is the branching pattern of branches of this valley oak. This is about a 300 or more year old valley oak. In the Gaviota Coast is where it resides, and that's at a place called Aurelia Ranch. So most of our valley oaks live in the valley. They don't live on the front country here facing the ocean, but there are a few living in canyons. And this one escaped logging, so it's a really beautiful tree. Branching pattern of this opened fern frond is obvious, kind of like a feather design or a Christmas tree or fern-like shape where you have a central axis and then symmetrically pairs of little branches coming off the sides. The branching pattern of this plant, the elephant ear, giant leaf, this is about 3 feet across, really obvious branching veins in the leaf. And erosion of water at a lake's edge or near the ocean forms branching patterns as it erodes through the substrate, sand or soil, moving back into the main body of water. Looks beautiful. Of course, we've got all kinds of branching patterns inside humans too. This is your respiratory system, and the human cardiovascular system is also highly branched, as is the neural system, the limbic system, and the lymph system, and many other systems in the human body. In our lungs, which this is a picture of where they inject resin into lungs and then the tissue is taken away and it's left with this model of what the insides of those chambers look like. Our windpipe branches into smaller and smaller and smaller tubes forming our lungs. At the end of those tubes are little pockets called alveoli where the surface area is maximized so more oxygen can move from the air that we breathe in into our bloodstream. So the more highly branched, the more efficient the system is in transferring things directly into an organism. Leaves on a canopy of a tree are the places that gases go into a plant. So again, that's the highly branched system is increasing the surface area for those gases to exchange. A really cool branching pattern underneath the leaf of a giant floating lotus plant that floats on the surface of water. Some of these get big enough that you can stand on them. Waves are also another pattern in nature that are seen and sometimes invisible, but found throughout the natural world. Waves in the ocean that on the shoreline are one of the few types of wave movements of energy and mass that are all kind of on a human scale. We can see them and really well, and we can ride them too if we're surfers. But most waves are invisible, like sound waves, light waves, radio waves. Yeah, but there are lots of examples of this too. The wavy patterns of these scallop shells and many other natural organisms have wave patterns in them. The wave pattern is a manifestation of the movement of sand grains through the wind in a desert dune system. It forms these waves also. Some ocean waves can be enormous, like this picture of me riding a wave at Chopu off Tahiti. I'm just kidding. I would never be on that wave. But it's a really cool example of a mega size of how the energy of the water moving towards the land, it's in the deep, deep ocean channel off of Tahiti, but then it suddenly hits shallower waters and it forces the water up and over itself to create this really heavy wave. Netted pattern is also really common in nature. Spider web with dew on it really shows the netted patterning form here that helps the spider maximize its ability to catch food. This picture I took at the racetrack, which is a very low ephemeral lake, low meaning shallow ephemeral lake in Death Valley that just maybe once a year it fills with a few inches of water for a very vast area, and acres are just like an inch deep lake. And because of that, there's been a lot of fine silty clay materials that have been deposited on the surface. And when it dries out, it cracks and forms this netted form. Netting can be seen often on the bark of trees, like this pine tree. and netting even on the camouflage of a fish. Tessellations are a certain type of pattern that can be seen. It's a natural pattern. And that's a repeating pattern of the same shape over and over again, kind of nested within each other. Tessellations are shown here in the honeycomb. You have that hexagonal shape that's repeated over and over again, right next to each shape, right next to each other with no spaces in between, and it forms this overall larger pattern, like a honeycomb. That's an example of a tessellation. This is an example of very symmetrical, nested within themselves leaves of this succulent, of a crassula succulent. It's a tessellation. You have a shape nested within a shape over and over next to each other, forming a larger shape, but it's also a repeated symmetry pattern. Stripes are common in nature, the zebra stripes. Striped pattern of coral, a head of coral, with a small sea star on top of it. Crenulate is also another pattern type, and we see that often inside of organisms. This succulent is actually in the crenulate shape. You can see it just twisted and turning on itself. Other crenulate shapes are the human brain, or this spider apple. It comes from the Osage orange tree, that orange thing the person's holding. The shape of the nut of a walnut inside. Those are all crenulate, and they are made to maximize surface area as well. Think of our intestines, and even though the intestines overall look crenulate, if you look at the walls of the intestines, they're highly folded to just have mega surface area in a small volume to increase the passage of nutrients from the food into the bloodstream. And just a few examples of larger scale types of patterning. These are ecological interactions, examples of where the loss of a top animal predator has a big effect on the entire ecosystem, like a cascade effect. So those animals are keys to the patterning of the whole system, keystone animals. So it's another way of thinking of patterns that are more about relationships than it is about shape. So all of these are things to just recognize and notice, and to keep them in our back pocket when we're designing something. We want to design something in a certain shape, a garden bed or an element or a chicken coop or a pathway. Adding or making them in using the form of a natural pattern can add beauty, because humans think all these shapes in general are very beautiful, but it also can add efficiency to your design too.